Right. Well, welcome to Storytelling 101 with myself. My name is Britt Gawley, and I'll give you a little bit more of an intro as we move into the presentation. But I like to jump right into things. And the first thing I want to get us to get the brains kind of those creative juices going. Write in the chat some answers for what are some reasons why we share stories. So if you can come up with three, but I'm happy if we start at one. What would be some reasons why we share stories? Yeah, great answer. To inspire, absolutely. To connect, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's a ton of reasons why we share stories, and it's so embedded into who we are as humans, and we're going to explore that today. But some of the big reasons why we use stories and why we share stories are to, like you said, inspire. It's to connect. It's to establish emotional rapport. We use stories to simplify ideas. So rather than reading like a jargon-filled descriptive text that explains maybe a complex concept, we can read a story that explains the same idea, having vivid characters, and this is really effective in conveying ideas that help create engaging, relatable, and practical examples. So we can simplify concepts. We can also broaden the reach because stories are super easy to communicate, and they're better remembered, and they spread very quickly. And just like inspiring, we can motivate, but we can also use stories to persuade. The common thread that ties all of these things together is connection. So storytelling, how I view it, and what really motivates me to do the work that I do is that I think of storytelling as a vehicle for connection. And if you're like, well, who are you? I'm Britt, and it's always hard for me to kind of narrow down what I do and who I am in one of those little bios. So I'll give you just a quick run through, but I am multi-passionate and I run an agency called Founders Media where we help brands and businesses tell their stories strategically. That's a big part of it. And we do that through photo shoots, brand shoots. We create campaigns. We also do videography and some filmmaking, and we do a lot of short form content and content production these days for social media. And before I started the agency, I actually was strictly just a solopreneur. I was a photographer for 8 years and photographed maybe some names that you might know, like Canadian Geographic Magazine, Canada's History Magazine, Health Magazine. I've been able to shoot covers for commercial magazines like Costco and photograph Olympic athletes, as well as Dr. Jane Goodall and David Suzuki, and also the King and the Queen of the Netherlands, and a whole bunch more, hundreds and hundreds of photo shoots over the years. But before that, and the reason I'm really passionate about sharing all the things about storytelling is because I actually used to be a teacher, an educator myself. And prior to that, because I lived 9 lives, I used to be a professional athlete. So I have a really diverse range of experiences, and this all informs the lens in which I view the world and contextualize the world around me. And storytelling is such a huge part of that. So today, I want your mission to be, and I love including Mission Impossible clips whenever I'm thinking about learning objectives and missions, because it's not a mission that's impossible. It's totally possible. So by the end of this, I want you to feel like you've learned how storytelling can unlock the potential to fuel hope, inspire action, and drive meaningful change. And that might just be for you personally, but you might want to, this might plant some seeds for you and give you some tools and some ways to kind of think about things differently to apply this in your life. So let's strap in and we're going to get right into the next exercise. Before I show this next photo, because we are really focusing here on mostly visual storytelling today, but storytelling across the board is obviously going to be applicable. But I just want to give you a heads up that this next photo is a little jarring. Now, it is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo, but I just want you to take a minute to look at it. I want you to think about, what do you notice? So look for the details in this photograph. What kinds of things do you notice? And you can actually put this in the, how does this make you feel? Is it evoking any emotions? yeah, it's evoking sadness, right? What else? What are some of the details that you can see in this image? Who's in there? What's in the background? So we can see soldiers, we can see children. Some don't have any shoes on. In the background, is that a cloud or is that smoke from something? The man on the right, is he a photographer? It looks like he is carrying a camera. And typically back in this day, they would have a couple of them with them as press. So this photo is actually called Napalm Girl. And like I said, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning frame of the young girl in the front there who's actually naked. She's fleeing her village after being torched by napalm. And this is done by a photographer named Nick Boot. And it really, to me, encapsulates all that is wrong with war, right? Like that feeling of sadness that you wrote in the chat, like you can't look at that and, well, I mean, some people might be able to, but for many of us, it'd be hard to look at a photo like this and not feel something. You just want to do something about it. And that's what good stories do. That's what good storytelling does. It evokes emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean that what we're witnessing is a good story, but good story, good art, the purpose of it is to evoke emotion. And this is how we can create change, is by using stories, just like this one image. It really changed the course of the Vietnam War when this was published, and it was controversial. Can we publish something like this in North America? There was a lot of questions that it brought up and a lot of discourse, and this is the power of story. So what's interesting is sometimes it's not just the image that we can see, but it's also the story of the story. So while this scene was taking place, this photographer, these kids were running towards him. He could see like that she was in pain. The back of her body was extremely badly burnt. This is why she didn't have clothes on, because they were literally torched right off of her. But he basically picked her up and took her to medical care right away. And there were so many people in the hospital at this point that they said, like, we're sorry, we can't help. And he said, I'm a photographer, and if you don't do something about this, you're going to be in trouble. And they actually treated her, because basically he used that I'm a photographer card, and not holding them hostage in any way, but kind of like, do something about it. She matters. She's a child. And they did. They treated her because of this photographer. And they kept in touch, which is really interesting over the years. That lady standing there is actually the woman, the young girl who was fleeing in that scene. And that's the photographer there years later. She ended up going to school in Cuba and then had a honeymoon in Moscow, I believe. And then when she was refueling, heading back to Cuba, they actually refueled on their flight in Newfoundland, Canada. And when they got to Canada, they actually asked for political asylum, which they were granted. So she actually lives in Toronto, and she travels the world now as a Goodwill ambassador for the UN and has started a nonprofit. But the story continues, right? And it's a rich story, and it's from that one photo that had the power to change the course of discourse. And this is just so inspiring in so many ways, even though it came out of a moment of massive adversity, massive sadness. So keep that in mind. When you never know, when you have your camera on you, whether it's your smartphone or digital or DSLR or mirrorless camera, what you can do with it. Now, it's important for me to lay down some context. So what is the origins of storytelling? It's important to take a look back to know why we do the things we do as society, because it gives us context for the way that we interpret the world around us. And storytelling has always been a part of our species history. So we are social beings, and we started this oral history, this oral storytelling tradition, as a means of survival, really. It was used to pass lessons down from generation to generation. And over time, we got a lot more creatively expressive. And this is cave art. You can actually find these cave drawings in France, and they date back to the Ice Age, which is in the Upper Paleolithic periods, but it's roughly between 14,000 to 40,000 years ago. So we've been storytelling for a long, long time, but our storytelling skills have evolved. So we went from oral and drawing to actually developing written language. We used hieroglyphs. This is actually a close-up of the Rosetta Stone, which you can go and still see today in person, actually. And we started using the animals like homing pigeons to communicate stories. There was a postal service, there was printing press, telegraphs, the telephone, radio. Story has been weaving in and out of the different aspects of how we communicate since we started. So now we've got smartphones and all different types of social media that we also tell stories on. But just thinking back to it, in the 14th, 15th, 16th century onwards, we started to see that a lot of myths were used to tell stories. And this is supposed to be a sea monster underwater. It's a stock photo, but it's hopefully going to give you that visual. But there were stories about sea monsters so that sailors would avoid different parts of the ocean that were potentially unmapped or that were strange seas and saw different sea creatures. And in the 16th century, we started to see basically fairy tales or folk tales. And I don't know if you've had the chance to read any sort of original fairy tales, but they're not that child friendly, but they were bestowing some sort of knowledge and lesson to whoever was reading them. And a lot of the population during those periods of history were actually illiterate. So it was still using that oral tradition to kind of create these characters and spread these messages and these lessons on a wider scale. But we still use storytelling from a young age. And we use storytelling from the time we're young in classrooms because we still teach lessons without kids even knowing that they're learning. And sometimes we do this as educators, sometimes we do this in marketing and in sales. So we're always using the power of story to broaden people's perspective about the way that they look at the world. And we look at and expand our perspective through story in really all different sorts of ways. The stories that we tell and the way that we tell them matter. I want you to just think about that. So why is that? Because as humans, we typically try to make information as digestible as possible. We typically categorize these stories into good stories and bad stories. You can try to think of what a good story might be. A good story might be a hero's journey. So maybe you studied this in English class. It might be the story of an underdog. It might be the story of somebody who's faced adversity and overcome it. So we might tell these stories to really inspire people, connect people. We also categorize stories into bad stories. And obviously this is a biased compilation. So you can make up your own mind of what a good and bad story is, but it's being educated about stories and how we use them so that you are able to dissect that kind of information. So here we've got, image of a shirtless Putin on a horse. We've got a smiling Trump. We've got a bird that's covered in oil, war, poverty. We have Hitler. So basically, we're just going over what good and bad stories are and what they might look like. But the important thing to note between how we kind of digest these two categories is that those who tell the stories rule the world. So these people have all had massive populations vote them into power. Hitler, we know, was a very captivating speaker. He had a lot of charisma. He was a great storyteller. He moved a whole bunch of people into action. So that's something that I want you to think about, whether the stories are good or bad. It's people who know how to utilize storytelling. And we can do this. We might be naturally really able to have proficient social skills, or we might be able to work on those and kind of use them like a muscle where we can kind of grow those skills over time. But storytelling has the power to rule the world if you know how to utilize it properly. And again, this is not a new concept. We've been doing it for a long time. This is actually a historical document, an image on the left. And we've got Stalin, who was using somehow Photoshop before Photoshop was even possible. Okay, it's still a mystery to me about how they were able to do this. There was a method called dodging and burning, but still, there's some early witchcraft happening there in terms of how they were able to do this. But basically, what Stalin did was he removed people from his story historically that he didn't want to be seen with. So anybody who kind of crossed him the wrong way or was an enemy, he actually removed them, as you can see. And we still do this in different ways. We still use photo manipulation, and that's still a topic, even in social media today. So we can look at Instagram and how we use it to tell stories. So this creator does it in a really interesting way where she doesn't actually have to say a lot, but she uses visuals to tell the story for her. So she's got, max 3 words to caption this. So Instagram, also Instagram. So on the left side, on the beach photo here, we can see that it's good lighting, it's a certain pose, and it's an optimal shot. Whereas on the one on the right, she's saying this is also Instagram. It's a different pose. It might be a little bit different lighting, but depending on what story we want to tell, what we want to put out there. And her message is all about body positivity and inclusivity. And she's able to do this with visuals. We really need to use this, or what she does is she really tries to use this as a means to connect with people who might be struggling with social media being sometimes a negative influence in a lot of young people and older people too, comparing themselves to what they're seeing, which might not be so realistic online. So she's shaping the narrative by using visual storytelling to do that. And my good old buddy here, Dr. Jane Goodall, who is the leading expert in the world with chimpanzees, and travels at the age of 90 for 300 days a year across the globe, preaching a message of hope and about the indomitable spirit. People pay, a lot of money all over the world to basically go and see her speak. Dr. Jane Goodall was in Vancouver, inspiring thousands of people just the other week. And she really has it down. It's what you have to do is to get into the heart. And how do you get into the heart? With stories. And the biggest, most successful brands that have a legacy, that really build a heritage brand, understand how to get into the heart. And here's a few examples of big brands. So Dunkin' Donuts, North Face, Nike, Geico, Old Spice, and Red Bull. And they know how to use the power of storytelling to move the market, to make people consume their products. And they do it by shaping a cool narrative like Dunkin' Donuts did here during the Super Bowl, where they had Tom Brady and Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. So they had the celebrity factor plus they just did it real well and their sales boosted. Now, another one that's really interesting that I'll focus more on is Red Bull. So Red Bull has a serious cool factor because their brand storytelling is really unique. If you go to Red Bull's social media, you will notice that you will pretty much never see a can of Red Bull on their feed anywhere, which is interesting because that's what they're selling. That's how they make money. But whoever's in marketing for Red Bull, I really applaud them because they understand that it's not the product that people are buying. It's how the product makes them feel. And I say that because their feed only features stories of athletes doing the most crazy extreme things. So it could be skiing down a mountain, it could be mountain biking, it could be parachuting. They're selling a lifestyle. They're telling lifestyle-oriented stories because the brand is then associated with that lifestyle, with those feelings, which is exciting, which is full of life, which is giving them wings, right? So Red Bull does a really fantastic job, and that's why they've been so successful. And most brands that do that, like Nike, for example, just do it. A lot of their messaging is powerful storytelling, and it's really like the underdog stories and work hard, just do it, take that action, just do it. And they drive that home because they understand the emotions that these stories evoke. So what I want you to think about is, what kind of storyteller do you want to be? What interested you in being here today? Are you kind of just curious about storytelling and what that means? Or are you into content creation or influencing? Are you interested in marketing? Are you interested in creating an impact or being an advocate for a cause? Is it just a diary for you or a sense of expression? Yeah, and some of us might not know, right? That might be why we're here today. We're just kind of curious about it. And I think that's a really exciting place to be, actually. A lot of us adults don't actually know either. I have some students who love writing, so they wanted to learn some strategies to get started. I love that. So hopefully this will help. And writing's a great way to tell story as well. They say some of the best storytellers are able to put it down onto paper, not just kind of talk in front of a crowd. So that's really interesting. Well, you can be whatever kind of storyteller you want to be. It doesn't have to fit into a category or a niche. You don't have to be into marketing and sales in the future or want to create a documentary or be the best thesis writer. What you need to do is have some sort of connection, right? Because storytelling is a vehicle for connection. So what's your connection to the story that you want to tell? Now, this is a photograph that I took of one of the last two northern white rhinos on the planet. So this species is considered functionally extinct. The last male died in 2018, and this is his daughter. And her mom is the other second rhino. So it's Najin and Fatu. Those are the names of the white rhinos, but you can kind of see her eyeball right here. And I'm telling you, when I locked eyes with Najin, I just thought, how am I ever going to articulate this feeling that I feel? It was, again, a feeling of overwhelming sadness to see such a beautiful creature be the last of its kind. It was also gratitude for the conservancy that I was at that 24/7 protects these two beings with armed guards. And the type of storyteller that I want to be, the reason that I left a classroom and wanted to take education kind of outside the four walls and use entrepreneurship and different types of storytelling, different modes and mediums to do that, was because impact was really important to me. So having access to moments like this and being able to share stories like this were really important. And how did I get there? Well, it's a really crazy story, but this gentleman right here is James. And sometimes you meet people in your life that, I think you've probably heard of soulmates. And I don't mean that necessarily in a romantic fashion. I mean that in more of a, you just connect with people on a different level. And James is one of those people for me. He was, and as you can see, they're on the cover here of National Geographic. This is Sudan. This is the male that did pass away, but James was one of his caretakers and was also, he calls the two girls that are left his girlfriends. So he was a caretaker and he witnessed extinction in real time. And before that experience was very different for him because of how he grew up. His story was very different. He didn't have shoes until he was 15 years old, and wildlife actually used to destroy the crops in his community. So there's a lot of human wildlife conflict. So when he got into becoming a ranger, and just so you know, if you're like into this kind of the ranger type stuff, he was 2018's African Ranger of the Year. So the entire continent, not just one country. He's based in Kenya. Through this situation, it changed him. It was no longer just a job for him. It really changed him, and he felt compelled to tell the story of why we should conserve in our own way, whether it's in our own backyard in small ways, because he never wanted anybody to have to witness something like this again. So him and I connected really deeply on that. He wanted to make an impact, and over the pandemic, him and I started talking just like this, virtually, sharing our stories with each other as a means to connect. And he expressed these dreams of having a business one day of an expedition company. And I said, well, why don't you just do it? Because I'm that little, just take that action, just go for it. And he was like, well, I can't afford to just stop working. I can't XYZ. I don't have the skills to develop a website and build out a business strategy. But luckily, when you use your stories, and sometimes you're vulnerable about them, whether you're going to do that through blogging or through your social media or through however that looks for you, a podcast, whatever medium you want to use, when you use these stories, sometimes things kind of align and come out of the woodworks. And I actually had somebody who volunteered to help him launch his business, map out a strategy for him, and build his website all pro bono because they believed in his cause and his mission, in his story. As you can see, I mean, they were on the cover of National Geographic. They did have a lot of notoriety as conservation heroes already, and he won that award. So he'd already had the street cred to do this. People wanted to help him with his mission. And 2 years later, he left caretaking to launch his business. And him and I decided to tell stories together. And so on top of what I told you I do before, I also guide safaris that are conservation oriented with James, because that's the type of impact that I want my stories to have. So you can actually come and experience it in real life, or you can come and be a storyteller and bring those stories to the people around you. It's really up to you what you want to do with that. But how do you want to tell your stories? This is, not on the typical timeline for how, what you're supposed to do in life, go to school, get married, buy the house, those kind of things. It's a little different, but we can make our own rules. And as storytellers, that's kind of the exciting part. It's like, what story do you really want to tell? What really lights you up inside? And for me, it's all a story. This is my new kind of mantra, which is do it for the plot. And sometimes there's activities during the day that I don't necessarily want to do, but I'm like, you never know what's going to happen. I can create some content out of it and have a story to tell. And I'll tell you one more story that I had where I've got lots of them, by the way, but imagine being this far away from massive humpback whales, a mother and a calf underwater. Well, I went about 100 miles off the coast of the Dominican Republic, and for 8 days, I spent my time being extremely seasick, but also the other portion of the time breathing like Darth Vader with a snorkel underwater and photographing these beautiful, beautiful creatures, these humpback whales. And before my mantra was do it for the plot, it was feel the fear and do it anyways. And this is because sometimes, the narratives that we're told and programmed in a societal fashion or in an institutional fashion might make us kind of have to fit in some sort of box or shelve different parts of our personality. But it's really sometimes okay to feel the fear and to be inspired by what draws you, where you feel that natural connection, that natural pull. So when some of you in the chat said, I don't know what kind of storyteller I want to be, I wasn't 100% sure when I went swimming with humpback whales, but I got to experience something that, again, is so hard to articulate and to verbalize, but the photos convey a lot of beauty. But I got to choose what kind of story I wanted to tell. When we're thinking about stories about climate action and climate change, or nature and wildlife or animal welfare, a lot of those narratives are heavy and very doom and gloom oriented. And to me, I actually find those like, I just want to turn off the TV when I see that. Instead, I wanted to create stories that were uplifting, that engaged people, that provided hope and inspiration. That's more my style. That's what speaks to me because I crave that. That feels naturally aligned for me. On the same trip, I also saw whales that were entangled in Canadian fisheries netting. And I could have told that story, but my choice was to say, hey, look at this beautiful moment where this mom did not have to let us in their space at all. Like they really choose. She was curious, and she actually had this really beautiful moment when she actually came up to the water because they go down to sleep. The mom can sleep for about 14 minutes, and then she has to come back up for air, whereas the calf, 6 or 7 minutes. So the calf was up there playing around before mom got up, kind of like, oh, is this how my, pectoral fins work? And then the mom woke up, and instead of being like, oh my God, like, let's get out of here, she kind of was like curious and like, oh, look at these people. Well, she didn't say this to us. This is how it felt. There was this really beautiful moment when she came up out of the water, extended her pectoral fins, exposed her stomach to us. And it was kind of like a look at how beautiful my baby is. And that's the story I want to tell. It's not the doom and gloom narrative, even though those are important. That's just not my style of storytelling. Mine is more feel the fear and do it anyways. So when you're thinking about what kind of storytelling you want to do, I want you to think about what kind of medium you feel more drawn to. So I have in the chat that some loved writing. So maybe writing is the medium, and that can be through different mediums. That could be through a blog, that could be through newspapers or editorials. So some of us enjoy writing, and that's our medium. Some of us enjoy using a photo or trying to create small films, or might want to be a content creator because they just, they love food and wanted to become a foodie. Whatever you naturally feel drawn to, that is what you can explore. You don't have to be the best at it. It's a skill that you can learn. Storytelling is like a muscle. But when you're thinking about choosing your medium, you also want to ask yourself, why am I telling this story? So are you telling it just to get likes and attention? Is it more ego driven, or is there a cause behind it? And, no hate to the ego driven ones. There's lots of people that are making a lot of money off of sharing certain stories and telling, and they might have a purposeful story. There's ways to do this that are tactful too. I also want you to think of, who is it for? So what kind of audience are you trying to connect with? Because storytelling is that vehicle for connection. So who are you trying to connect with? Who is this for? I also want you to think about, how should I tell this story? So for example, if you're talking about residential schools, for example, and you are a straight cisgender male identifying person, are you the right person to be talking about the experiences of people who have lived through a residential school experience? Or is there someone that you can collaborate with that can help you tell this story and help get this story out? So think about, because that voice is really important. Again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the way we tell the stories and how we tell them, it matters. So think about these types of things when you are taking this into consideration. And then, which format should I use? So again, it might be a different medium, or you might want to explore with different formats. So it could be short blog posts, it could be essays, it could be whatever works best for you. And with that, I want you to think about, in a reflective way, whether you achieved your mission. So your mission was to learn how storytelling can unlock the potential to fuel hope, inspire action, and drive meaningful change. And we talked about the origins of storytelling, and we talked about how you can use storytelling in a good way or bad way, and how people who tell stories rule the world. And how do you get into the heart with stories? And thinking about what kind of storyteller you want to be, and asking yourself those 4 questions. So why am I telling this story? Who is it for? How should I tell this story? And should you collaborate with anyone else? And which format should you use? Do you think you achieved your mission? Did you learn how you can impact change using stories? But did you achieve your mission? Were you able to take some inspiration about how the power of storytelling can actually impact change? So think of that one photo at the beginning about the Vietnam War. Well, thank you for joining us today. Again, I'm Britt Gawley, and this was Storytelling 101. And if you want to connect with me to see some of the storytelling that I do, a lot of it is done through social media these days, and my handle is there at the bottom. You're welcome to follow along on those stories. Otherwise, feel free to reach out via email or to UBC with any further questions. There's going to be other exciting workshops coming up in the future, so stay tuned, and thank you.